History tends to bury what it seeks to reject, and it was no accident that male-dominated history excised the leadership of women who made essential connections between sexism, racism, poverty, and war. Throughout American history, trailblazers have sought for change through single-issue activism. However, one person in particular has stood out, claiming that lasting equality would necessitate linking reforms because every fight for justice is interconnected. Though her impact remains in Americans' lives every day, she has largely been forgotten in history. Her unique beliefs are a testament to the price of progress. Crystal Eastman, an American lawyer and social reformer, pushed the boundaries of activism by incorporating multifaceted principles into various reforms. Although her legacy is very complex, her career can be summarized through workers' rights, women's rights, and World War I pacifism. Through being a powerful orator who advocated for reconstructing societal roles for women, building framework for workers' compensation, and establishing standing activist organizations, Eastman's radical strides in upholding responsibilities of individuals and the government made her a key figure in securing constitutional rights for all Americans. Gender roles in late 19th and early 20th century America minimized women's rights by confining them to domestic responsibilities. Furthermore, women often found themselves financially dependent on their husbands because they were unable to work or received roughly half the wage of a man. These patriarchal foundations of American society provided a framework for Crystal Eastman's upbringing. In 1881, Eastman was born in Marlborough, Massachusetts as one of 4 children of Samuel Elijah Eastman and Anna Bertha Ford. Early in her childhood, tragedy struck when her father developed a chronic illness during the Civil War, leaving him unable to work. In desperate circumstances, her mother became a pastor at Park Church in Elmira to support their family. She also became a prominent feminist, using her platform to advocate for gender equality after witnessing America's patriarchal flaws. Crystal Eastman's family struggles and her mother's feminist legacy paved the way for her to become a passionate activist and an astute critic of the flawed systems of her time. To start her career, Crystal Eastman earned her law degree from NYU in 1907, making her one of only a few hundred female lawyers in America at the time. Although initially experiencing gender discrimination while trying to find work, she was eventually able to begin her activist crusade on the frontier of workers' rights. In the 20th century, workplace conditions were brutal. Spanning from exposure to toxic chemicals to unsafe machinery, workplaces became increasingly hazardous, causing a surge in injuries and deaths. This impacted not just workers, but also numerous families who were left with little to no financial support when tragedy struck. Crystal Eastman sought to improve these conditions, believing safe workplaces were a basic human right that businesses had a responsibility to uphold. Notably, she identified the lack of research on workplace conditions as a major issue, as she believed it made it difficult to find areas for improvement. She remarked, "I believe in statistics just as firmly as I believe in revolutions." To address this, Eastman attained her first job accompanying her acquaintance Paul Kellogg to investigate working conditions in Pittsburgh, sponsored by the social science organization Russell Sage Foundation. In addition to the work done by dozens of investigators, their research led to the Pittsburgh Survey, which was the first in-depth study of industrial accidents in the United States. Eastman's findings prompted her to publish the article Employers' Liability: A Criticism Based on Facts, a pioneering paper that revealed a multitude of unsafe workplace practices. This not only launched Eastman's career, but also sparked an increase in discussion about workers' rights. Because of her research with the RSF, Eastman was asked to serve in New York State's Commission for Employers' Liability and Causes of Industrial Accidents in 1909. She broke several barriers by being the first woman appointed to this role and drafting the first workers' compensation law in the U.S. This law created mandatory responsibility for employers to compensate for workplace injuries. She also asserted that it makes every serious accident a considerable cost to an employer and thus ensures his invaluable cooperation with the Labor Department in promoting safety. Unfortunately, on March 24, 1911, the law was struck down by the Supreme Court. However, the day after the court's ruling, the need for reform became devastatingly clear in the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where 146 workers lost their lives and their families received almost no compensation. Following this event, several states enacted workers' compensation laws based on Crystal Eastman's model. She continued to champion workers' rights with investigations on labor conditions in factories all around the country. The culmination of research resulted in her revolutionary 1910 seminal report, Work Accidents and the Law. Not only did she shed light on the shocking 526 workplace fatalities around the nation in a single year, but she also debunked causes and consequences of workplace injuries that influenced legislation for workers' rights across the nation. Another significant reform in Crystal Eastman's career was women's rights activism. This advocacy began in 1912 when she led a campaign for women's suffrage in Wisconsin. However, this effort was unsuccessful due to severe opposition. For example, Wisconsin breweries strongly opposed women's suffrage because they feared their support for temperance would hurt business. Overall, the suffrage movement as a whole faced widespread opposition. The National Association opposed to women's suffrage argued that women's enfranchisement would draw them away from their domestic responsibilities, asserting it would produce identity instead of division of labor. Additionally, many critics argued Darwinism ideology, claiming that women were both physically and intellectually less capable than men and therefore did not deserve equal rights. Although various other claims were made, the true motivation masked behind most opposition was the male fear of losing power. Despite her failure in the Wisconsin suffrage campaign, she persisted in her efforts to advance the movement. Eastman co-founded the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in 1913 and served on the advisory board that helped to establish the legal prospects for drafting the 19th Amendment, which would grant women's suffrage. Both the organization's protests and Eastman's work on the council resulted in significant advances in the women's suffrage movement that culminated in the 19th Amendment's ratification in 1920. However, while the passage of this amendment was a major victory, Eastman felt that it should not be the end of the fight for women's freedom. Directly following the ratification of the 19th Amendment, she asserted in her Now We Can Begin speech, "Men are saying perhaps, thank God this everlasting women's fight is over. But women, if I know them, are saying now at last we can begin." She emphasized that women now had a responsibility to continue to fight for equality not just for women, but for society as a whole with their newly gained suffrage. The speech set her apart as a feminist and inspired the hearts of thousands of women across the country. Moreover, Crystal Eastman's role in World War I pacifism was one of the most significant aspects of her career because it transformed the responsibilities of women and the government and later paved the way for broader equality reforms. Throughout World War I, women were significant leaders of pacifist movements. Certain anti-war activists, including Eastman, believed that women had a responsibility to fight for their country's peace because male-led governments failed their responsibility of doing so by allowing the US to join World War I. Despite working on various pacifist organizations, the most prominent in her career was the American Union Against Militarism, which she co-founded in 1917. The AUAM condemned US involvement in European conflicts, particularly World War I and conscription. However, an obstacle arose when Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which violated First Amendment rights by censoring anti-war views or criticism of the government. Believing the government was responsible for protecting constitutional rights, Eastman created a branch within the AUAM, the National Civil Liberties Bureau. This later evolved into the American Civil Liberties Union, expanding its advocacy to champion a broader spectrum of rights. While Eastman's activism was essential to each of these movements, she never favored one above the other. She instead sought to connect them, arguing that equality was intersectional across all reforms. As a result, she was among the first to embody internationalism, which is known today to be intersectionality.
She worked her whole career to try to unify all of these equality-oriented movements under one big emancipatory rubric. She would bring, for example, feminism into the peace movement. She would try to bring internationalism or peace or racial equality to the feminist movement.
Crystal Eastman's belief in multifaceted reform set her apart as an activist as she advocated equality for every American. However, this led to distinct setbacks as many organizations rejected her interconnected ideology. As a result, The Liberator, a magazine she co-founded with her brother Max Eastman, became her main platform for these ideas. Additionally, her progressive views have led her work to be undermined through history.
Often seem to be, kind of pushing apart the leadership hierarchy and the kind of policy priorities of every organization. She saw that as enlarging them and bringing them together, as unifying. But on the ground, it was often experienced as divisive. And as a consequence, I think, she was, it was hard to place her within all these different movements. And so, when the stories of those movements were written, when the biographies of those leaders were written, she was often pushed out of the narrative.
Crystal Eastman's contribution to American society should not be overlooked. She has left a long-lasting impact through interconnecting reforms and upholding civic responsibilities that have secured numerous American rights. After the Supreme Court initially ruled Eastman's workers' compensation statute unconstitutional, she drafted a stronger version in 1913, which was passed in New York. Through rallies and protests, her Workers' Compensation Act passed in Congress in 1915, which remains in effect today. Additionally, her groundbreaking research set a foundation for several workers' compensation legislation drafts by highlighting the causes and consequences of workplace accidents. Lastly, the ACLU organization Eastman co-founded has remained a prominent champion for equality. The ACLU has played essential roles in numerous significant Supreme Court cases, including Brown v. Board of Education, which ended segregation within schools and revolutionized the future of equity. Furthermore, Eastman's legacy of intersectionality has left a lasting impact on the organization's goals today.
People would ask me why the ACLU was my organization and not something else. My answer was always, I don't want to be working for the rights of me or my people. Yeah, it's all connected. And I think that's one of the inspirations of Crystal Eastman, that if you look at the ACLU's list of 14 different areas where it works, it is all connected. And if some people are not equal, then there's a threat to equality for everybody.
When she spoke to people, whether it was to a small committee or a swarming crowd, hearts beat faster. She was for thousands a symbol of what the free woman might be. Crystal Eastman was a revolutionary activist who interconnected reforms such as workers' rights, women's rights, and pacifism to secure equality for all. Through pioneering initiatives that fought for Americans' constitutional rights by upholding responsibilities spanning from individuals to the government, Eastman's activism has and will continue to safeguard the rights of all Americans.